Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very proud to follow my colleagues' remarks on Bill C-51 in this House and join the debate today. And I'm going to be expressing my concerns with respect to this bill, Mr. Speaker. And then once again, I can't resist dwelling on the lack of priority to our public policy, specifically justice policies of this government, Mr. Speaker. Their lack of ambition in some areas is striking. Their use of time allocation motions is equally striking. And we have before us a bill here that is much ado about nothing in many ways, Mr. Speaker. It's an omnibus bill that they're using closure on. They're time allocating, they're ending debate on a very large justice bill that contains one very important area, Mr. Speaker, that I think is critical for us to discuss in this Parliament. And it's critical for us as parliamentarians to also discuss the elements contained in this specific part of the bill outside of this chamber, in our communities, in consultations with victims groups, with law enforcement, with students. And that's the zero tolerance towards sexual assault in our society, Mr. Speaker. The clear rules on consent, and that consent cannot be given when someone is intoxicated, Mr. Speaker. I think an approach that most of us think would be common sense, but has been confirmed in this legislation, but has already been confirmed by our common law, Mr. Speaker. And the outrage that occasionally happens when some judges have not followed that approach to our common law. So there are various provisions in C-51 related to the important work on consent, on evidence in sexual assault trials, Mr. Speaker. I would like to, in particular, comment on the MP from Sturgeon River Parkland, our former interim leader of the Conservative Party, for her exceptional work on judicial training, Mr. Speaker. And why I'm highlighting that is because it shows while this bill is well-intentioned on this provision with respect to sexual assault consent and evidence at trial, our common law should actually take care of this, Mr. Speaker. While it's good for Parliament to clearly weigh in and amend the code with respect to this, our judges are on the front lines, and they should be approaching this with a zero tolerance with respect to sexual assault cases where the victim has been intoxicated, in some cases by the person that then perpetrated the attack, Mr. Speaker. So I think all members here have no patience for that type of conduct in our society, Mr. Speaker. Certainly very proud that our government passed the Victims' Bill of Rights and for a time in Canada put victims at the core of our justice system, Mr. Speaker. So that one part of this omnibus bill is important for us to talk about, even though the common law is addressing the issues that this bill purports to address. The other aspects of this are unnecessary. The charter statement to be attached to all bills, there's already opinions given on the charter application with respect to legislation by lawyers, justice lawyers, as part of the legislative process, Mr. Speaker. Other groups outside Parliament can weigh in on their thoughts with respect to the charter, but there is no need for this sort of charter stamp to come with each bill, Mr. Speaker, because Parliament is supreme. If the court determines down the road that there's a provision that needs clarification as a result of the charter, it's up to this Parliament then to provide that clarity, Mr. Speaker. And as you know, better than most, because you're someone who is a champion of our parliamentary democracy, no Parliament is held to the laws of a previous Parliament, Mr. Speaker. So that provision with respect to charter opinions or the charter statements in this bill is unnecessary and is really being done for political posturing, Mr. Speaker. And finally, the last part of this omnibus bill is the so-called removal or amending of no longer relevant criminal code provisions, Mr. Speaker, or seldomly used criminal code provisions. Some would call this a cleanup part of the omnibus bill, Mr. Speaker. Is that so pressing that we're here using closure on debate to ram this through, Mr. Speaker? the last time there's been a duel in Canada, I'm not sure when that occurred, Mr. Speaker. I know there's two sword links separating the government from the opposition, but I don't suspect they are planning on us calling for a duel, Mr. Speaker. Witchcraft, Mr. Speaker. These are provisions that I think are historical curiosities, Mr. Speaker. But what's outrageous is this government, and I'm glad their House Leader is here, Mr. Speaker, this government has passed 19 bills in their time in this Parliament. 19 have achieved royal assent. And they're hitting around the 30th time that they've limited debate in this chamber on such a low record. And I tried to highlight this in a previous speech last week, Mr. Speaker. It's startling, the hypocrisy of this government. You know, the House Leader, who's mildly heckling me now, her deputy was the one that would feign outrage in the previous Parliament if time allocation was used, if omnibus legislation was used. In fact, the member from Winnipeg North, who's now joined in her heckling, Mr. Speaker, called it an assault on democracy. That's what he referred to omnibus legislation, Mr. Speaker, an assault on democracy. The last week in this House, Mr. Speaker, all I've seen is omnibus legislation shepherded by the MP from Winnipeg North. The hypocrisy is stunning. The House Leader for the Liberal government is using closure more than they've passed bills, Mr. Speaker. The denominator is not matching up to show that they're actually being productive, Mr. Speaker. They're limiting parliamentary debate and really getting nothing done. It's startling. And I'll remind my friend from Winnipeg North, because he's so verbose in this place, he just gives me a wealth of information to draw on, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to time allocation, what did he say? In November of 2012, he said, quote, "Never before have I experienced a government that is so persistent in using time allocation, a form of closure, using it as frequently as this particular government House Leader does."
Well, what goes around comes around.
End quote. Mr. Speaker, his government House Leader is using it far more than the Conservative House Leader did. I hope that at least behind closed doors, Mr. Speaker, he's expressing to her the same amount of outrage and indignation that we used to hear regularly in the last Parliament, Mr. Speaker. Between the assaults on democracy and the limitation of debate, Mr. Speaker, it's stunning that he can stand in this place and speak without a smile, Mr. Speaker, because it really is startling. I'll use the remainder of the time I have to show why this is hurting public policy development in Canada, Mr. Speaker. We have an omnibus bill that's full of removing, critical parts of our criminal code like witchcraft, yet they're not passing S3.
Exactly.
The Deschenaux decision of the Quebec Superior Court, Mr. Speaker. Their Indigenous Affairs Minister did not even call Mr. Deschenaux to the Parliament and consult on their bills, Mr. Speaker. They had till July 3rd to pass legislation with respect to that court. Yet this House Leader puts omnibus bills full of witchcraft and other historical curiosities. They put a motion on Paris that was meaningless, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing other motions, and they're not getting their own work done, Mr. Speaker. If they want to do an omnibus bill on justice, how about addressing the Jordan decision, Mr. Speaker? Because I'll tell you, victims who've seen accused murderers and accused sexual assault criminals being released as a result of judicial delays, that is the reform we need to see to justice. We've been asking for a year and a half for the minister to appoint judges. We've been pushing to get delays down, Mr. Speaker. They're allowing accused criminals to be released because of their inaction. And their so-called justice omnibus bill, they're addressing dueling and witchcraft, but not the Jordan decision, Mr. Speaker. That speaks to the priorities of the Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. A lot of talk on victims, while they're not funding a registry for dangerous sexual offenders, Mr. Speaker, while they're not addressing the Jordan decision, Mr. Speaker, while they talk about nation-to-nation dialogue with our First Nations, yet don't even call Mr. Deschenaux to help pass important legislation? I hope we all go back to our ridings in the summer, Mr. Speaker, and that the government House Leader and her deputy reflect on the decline of our parliamentary democracy under their watch, and we come back in the fall to a full apology from them. Thank you.